Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I saw we already have a comment that says ears are open and ready to learn. So I just want to give you guys all a heads up right now and let you know that I am right there with you. I had a brief conversation with Sarah the other day to kind of explain the podcast and prepare. And I definitely feel like I have a lot to learn from Sarah myself. So y'all are just going to sit with me as I ask as many questions of her as I can and listen intently. If you guys have not seen any of Sarah's work before, definitely go check that out on her LinkedIn. Sarah is the principal U.S. economy reporter at Bankrate. I wanted to make sure I got that right. And I'm very excited to have her join us today. Good morning, Sarah, joining us from the East Coast. How are you doing today?
Good morning. Thanks so much, Samantha. I've been really looking forward to this.
Yes, I'm excited to have you. And I also realized the other day when we were talking that somehow I've made it 12 episodes and you were my first female guest. So I really appreciate you. We're going to get things kicked off. I think it's going to be great today and definitely one to remember. So, can you start just by introducing yourself a little bit more and letting everybody know what it is that you do?
Yeah. So I cover the economy, the Federal Reserve, economic policy, everything that falls under the economy umbrella for Bankrate. And I've been at Bankrate since January 2019. So it's been a while, but it's been a crazy ride because little did I know that a year before I started covering this, that we'd be going through a pandemic. We'd see, the most aggressive Fed since really the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. And of course, now we're on the foil of that with the most aggressively hawkish Fed. So
Yeah.
it's been a really fun ride, really wild ride to say the least. I don't think any of us really expected this, but I will say that one of the best things about working at Bankrate is that we really try to explain all of these complicated topics in a way that everybody can understand because everybody has impacted them. So we all, have the right to that information. And
Yes.
so hopefully we can continue that today.
Yes, and that's why I'm so excited to have you on as well, because that was kind of one of the goals of Meet Me for Coffee was to help educate people in my industry, which is transportation, freight, and logistics, on a variety of things, but specifically on economics, because it is so closely intertwined into really everybody's everyday life. And I bet a lot of your friends, when you first got into being an economist, we're like, wow, that seems so exciting. And then in the last few years, they've probably all been like, Sarah, what's going on? Help us understand. So it's an exciting time for sure. And I think we have a lot of people being a lot more receptive to trying to understand economics right now. I think that's especially true in our industry. So I'm really excited that I got you this week of all weeks to come on because it's pretty timely right now. You just mentioned that you cover the rate hikes, and we are anticipating some news this week on the latest from the Fed there. So talk to me about what you think that decision might look like. Actually, let's take it a step back. Talk to me about where are we right now and how did we get here as it pertains to rate hikes, and then let's get kind of that maybe crystal ball out for a second and talk about what we think is going to happen this week.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The Fed right now, just today, started its May policy meeting, which we could be looking at an interest rate hike tomorrow.
Right.
I think it's a really big day specifically because this could be the last rate hike of this rapid tightening cycle. And to really talk about why this is such a big deal, you do have to kind of go back because we saw, the most aggressively hawkish Fed really since the 1980s in response to this rapid run up in prices. So Wednesday could be the 10th rate hike. Maybe 10th is the charm. Of course, we're taking rates up to a target range of about 5 to 5.25%. That's going to be the highest in more than 16 years. We also, last year we got 7 rate hikes alone. I think what's really kind of eye-opening about all of this is that the Fed, not only did they move so aggressively, but they also hiked interest rates in such massive moves. We saw 4 interest rate hikes worth 3/4 of a percentage point, which the Fed hadn't done that for several decades. It was since 1994, that was the last time that the Fed hiked rates by that amount. And I think, one thing that's really been really rewarding covering the economy at this time is that because the Fed has moved so aggressively and because we've really lived through the middle of some of these big economic events, it's been a lot easier to really demonstrate to people why this matters. Because when you look at really the impact of all of these rate hikes, of course, every financial decision we make comes back to that. So, we've seen mortgage rates last year, they doubled. They've come down a little bit to start this year as it looks
Right.
like the economy is slowing. HELOCs, they doubled. We also saw home equity loans hit the highest since 2009. Savings rates, I think that's the kind of the good news here. You're going to be earning a lot more than you would have over the past 10 years on those savings accounts if you shop around. But I think one of the reasons why the Fed has moved so aggressively, of course, is because they were kind of caught on their toes when it comes to inflation. We can talk
Mhm.
a little bit more about that too, but
Yeah.
I think the
I
Fed.
think I
Oh,
think
go.
that that's to your point about like a lot of this being the first time that anything like this has happened in the last decades or years. A lot of our workforce now is millennial or younger. And so overwhelmingly, a large percentage of those people have not lived through, at least in an adult lifetime, any of these events or similar in the past. And so for a lot of people right now, both in business and just in their personal lives, this is the first time they're trying to understand what's going on and kind of grapple with that. I have a younger brother who just bought his first house, and so he's coming to me for advice on should I wait, should we buy now, what's going on, interest rates and all of this. So I think to back to inflation, and so we will get to that in a minute. But real quick, what are you thinking? If we could try to pretend to get into the heads of the people in the Fed this week, what do you think is most likely?
Yeah. So this week, sorry, I think a
You're
little
good. You're
lagging
good.
there.
You're
I
back.
didn't miss your question, but I think what we could likely see is the 10th interest rate increase worth a quarter of a percentage point. So we're back at that real traditional amount that kind of prevailed before the financial crisis. But of course, I think the Fed will not really indicate that this could be the last rate hike because, of course,
Right.
the economy and kind of the way inflation and all of this has evolved has been humbling, to say the least. It's been humbling for the reporters like me who track it. It's been especially humbling for the policymakers whose main job is predicting what's going to happen with the economy. I think a lot of my favorite kind of quote about predicting the economy is basically economists are made to look weather forecasters look good. So I think that just kind of demonstrates just how difficult it could be. But we
Yeah.
could be seeing the last rate hike, but of course the Fed might not want to really back itself into a corner. So I think you could expect some vagueness around that.
Right. I think that you're probably right there, especially because, up until this point, I don't think things have exactly gone exactly like we all thought that they might. And so giving any indication of what they may or may not do in the future, which is going to be entirely dependent on the results of this rate hike and the direction we're headed. I bet you're right about that vagueness. So not that I'm an economist by any means, but I think I agree. I appreciate that, Sarah. So talking about kind of the next big topic, which I feel like you can't talk about rate hikes right now without addressing inflation, as that's the driver for the reason we're seeing all of these rate hikes. So just talk to me a little bit about that and how exactly monetary policy is making an attempt here to control inflation. And then I've seen some people kind of have some debates on, since this is such a unique market right now, since we're in such kind of a different time than we were the last time that this was attempted, is monetary policy still the right answer here, and will it still be effective and bring the desired results to curb inflation?
Yeah, well, these are all huge topics. And I think you even have to kind of go back to kind of why inflation really took off the way that it did. And I think even policymakers at the Fed were not exactly aware of the full story because of how complex that the inflation issue was. So back in November 2021, that was when inflation hit its first 40-year high. And of course, we didn't see inflation peak until about June 2022. And at that time, the Fed had just been getting started raising interest rates. So it's fair to say that they were pretty late to the game. And I think they knew that because back in November, that was right when the Fed was getting started with tapering its asset purchases. It was the Fed had purchased large amounts of government-backed bonds to hopefully help stimulate the economy a little bit more during the pandemic. And of course, they were slowing those purchases. They saw that inflation hit that 40-year high in November. I think they panicked just a little bit, and that's why you saw the Fed in December uh, speed up the pace of its so-called tapering. And of
Right.
course, I think when you look at maybe why the Fed was so slow in responding to inflation, I think there's lots kind of part of it. It was a lot to do with the fact that it's hard to really start slowing down the economy when you're still buying bonds. So that was one thing that they had to address before they could start raising interest rates. But it was also because for the longest time, even economists outside of the Fed thought that inflation was largely transitory. And
Right.
that's
I was like,
because
there's that magic word that we all heard a lot. Yeah.
yeah, transitory. It was the buzzword. You heard it talked about on, Constitution Avenue by Federal Reserve officials. You heard it talked about by economists, even on Wall Street. It was everywhere. Of course, we thought it was transitory because of base effects. So if you're comparing inflation from a year during the pandemic when the economy came to a grinding halt, 2021, it's likely going to look a lot hotter because of that comparison. We also saw supply shortages, bottlenecks, all of those took place. But something that I think has been really eye-opening is hear Powell talk about, the look back on how the Fed was also in the middle of this major regime shift where they were hoping to help stimulate the economy to get more people back to work, which is a noble cause. But
Right.
back last year at the end of 2022, we even heard Powell say that they might not do that again. So I think where we're seeing inflation right now, it's kind of a different story. I think you still do have some supply chain issues, but you also have an extraordinarily tight labor market.
Right.
Obviously, we know that rent and housing prices are climbing. They might be leveling off a little bit right now, according to real-time indicators, but the CPI, of course, lags that. So
Mhm.
the Fed, I think, they're still trying to address some of the aftermaths of keeping rates so stimulative for so long.
And I think we're still trying to kind of hold out hope or keep fingers crossed that we've avoided a recession, or some people say we've already had a recession or that we're going to inevitably be in one. I think, and this could just be me and what I've observed, but what I feel has been kind of the trend is we've had people calling for a recession now for over a year. And it's like somehow it just keeps getting prolonged. It's like we just keep kicking this can like further down the road of like, are we going to really enter a recession or not? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Like, are we in a recession? Are we entering a recession? If so, for how long? How bad do we think this to be? And I've heard multiple economists and reporters give various opinions here. So I'd love to grab yours today.
Yeah, well, I say whenever I'm asked this question, which I'm even asked this in my personal life a lot too,
Yeah.
my kind of pocketbook answer that I always say is that it's really not anyone's, we don't have the ability to declare whether we're in a recession. The only ones who do is the private sector research group of economists on the National Bureau of Economic Research. So they're the ones who have, the sole authority of declaring when recessions begin, when they end. And a lot of times we don't even know up to maybe even a full year after a recession has begun that we're currently in one. But I will say that I think Americans have surely, I mean, they've been feeling the impact of inflation, which is not unlike taking a pay cut when you can't
Right.
afford to purchase the same goods and services. So essentially, this question of are we in a recession? Are we not in a recession? This might be a moot point to Americans who've just been really struggling to handle affording everyday essentials, even the items that they need. But I think what we see at Bankrate is that a lot of the economists that I talk to say that we most likely aren't in a recession because we still have that exceptionally strong labor market. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, we saw that the unemployment rate is back down to 3.5%, which was, of course, the pre-pandemic low. We get another jobs report on Friday, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
Busy week in the world of economics, but we survey economists as well, and they currently put the odds of a recession for 2023 at 64%.
Okay. Okay. Now, I like the point that you brought up about, whether or not it's technically a recession. it still does matter how consumers feel, right? How this impacts them, because quite frankly, a lot of people probably don't care if it was on paper as a recession, if it felt like a recession in their homes, to them, to their pocketbooks, to their savings accounts. So I think a lot of people right now are feeling like maybe we're in a similar market to 2008, 2009, and they're kind of starting to have these fears that, you know, especially the people who remember going through that recession period. And a lot of us, you know, the millennials and younger generations, we were still around for that, and a lot of us remember that, even if we weren't quite adulting on our own or whatever that might be. But um, talk to me about that, because I've heard some people say, you know, no, this is nothing like where we were at from a market condition standpoint in 2008. And if it is different and we're not in a similar market condition as that time, like what's different? Like what's different from 2008 to 2023 that we're still technically probably going to be in a recession, but it's not going to look the same like it did in one of our last really notable recessions.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Something that I've been working on pretty frequently at Bankrate is kind of covering these younger Americans who've been really held back by the economy. I even found that a lot of them have something that I kind of came up with called recession fatigue, which is where, you know, you've been
Yeah.
living through so many tough economic times. It really scars you, and I think you automatically assume that when you say the R word, recession, it automatically means something as severe as the Great Recession and even maybe, you know, the coronavirus pandemic, which obviously we know eclipsed that as far as at least
Mhm.
severity.
Yeah.
But what we've been telling people is that recessions are rarely as severe as the Great Recession. And in fact, it's very uncommon for recessions to be back to back as severe as the Great Recession and the coronavirus pandemic. I think when the reason why you kind of look at maybe why this economic environment is so much different than 2008, even the coronavirus pandemic, is because, you know, we're still seeing delinquency rates are really low, default rates are really low. This is really not about an imbalance in the economy. It's mostly about the Fed having to slow the economy to make sure that price pressures are back into their target of 2%. And so I think that this is really important to keep an eye on. But of course, as we've been talking about, for some households, recessions begin and end absent of what's going on in the broader economy, especially if you lose your job, if you feel impacted by inflation. I just worked on a story a couple weeks ago that kind of found that even after inflation cools, Americans could still be feeling the impact of it because they've likely taken on more credit card debt. Maybe they've saved less for emergencies. Some of them have even saved less for retirement, have maybe even stopped saving for retirement at all. And of course, all of those financial steps, which it's important to save, it's important to prepare for emergencies and to prepare for retirement. Of course, if you're not taking those steps, it can be damaging to your finances down the road. And I think that's when you could maybe see the lingering impacts of this tough economic environment hang on for longer.
And I think in my mind, you know, it's kind of difficult. This is kind of a weird, weird viewpoint, maybe, but during the pandemic, we know that that was a recession. But I think so many of us were also just grappling with a pandemic that we weren't really so much worried about, like the economic side of things. Like we think about that as like the pandemic. We don't talk about it as the pandemic recession that we were in. And I think one of the reasons why is because it was also, I mean, really so succinct. Like we things dropped so far so fast, but then rebounded fairly quickly. And like, look at where we're at now. And that happened, you know, what feels like it was just yesterday. And we had some really high highs, and now we're kind of toying with this word recession again. And so I think what I would be better interested in understanding is during the pandemic, you saw a lot of people very quickly find themselves in a very undesirable position financially, you know, just home stability, all sorts of different things. But then we progressed into record low unemployments. We progressed into record wage increases for a majority of working Americans. Savings accounts were able to really become padded. Like a lot of people were paying off debt. They were getting more financially stable. And we saw all this great improvement in a relatively short period of time. I think what concerns me more is I don't feel like there is a end in sight right now for this period of inflation, or, you know, increased home costs. I just listened to a podcast the other day that said the median home price for a single family home was $348,000 compared to last year at like $280,000. That's a big difference in a pre-approval rating for younger families and people trying to get started. So there's all these things right now that I'm just wondering what starts to make these things improve. How do we get out of this? And if this does continue to extend for the next, some people are saying all of 2024, do we think that consumers and the average household are in a financial position to be able to sustain current interest rate levels, current mortgages, and all of this for another year to a year and a half?
Yeah, well, I would even kind of go back to that first point that you brought up about how obviously Americans, they might not have really felt as severe of an impact from the coronavirus pandemic as they did during the Great Recession. That
Right.
was kind of a contradictory point that I even was struck by, kind of looking at the data. We saw that, household net worth actually rose despite the fact that we were in a very devastating recession.
Right.
And so I think kind of the reason maybe why Americans were allowed or able to afford to save so much during the pandemic, despite maybe so many of them losing their positions, is because the federal government really moved so quickly and so aggressively to help bridge people through that devastating time. And I think even today we're kind of seeing the impacts of it. Of course, it depends on obviously your household income. At the lower income spectrum, we've kind of seen households already exhaust those elevated savings levels. But Morgan Stanley estimates that about $900 billion in excess savings is still out there. And so I think right now that could be one of the reasons why maybe Americans are still able to keep pace with spending.
Right.
Obviously, we've seen a little bit of a cool down at the start of the year, but it's still helping a little bit. But I think as far as, that question about, where do we go from here, kind of I kind of read it as hopefully the silver lining. I think,
Yeah.
could Americans and millennials like us afford to buy a home eventually? I think, the question ultimately is kind of looking at longer term trends of inflation, separating that out from, this price burst that we recently got. One of these stories that I recently worked on, I saw that college tuition, for instance, that's climbed 700% since
Right.
1984. Home prices have doubled since 1984, even adjusted for inflation. So I think there are these longer term issues that younger Americans are going to grapple with. And we even saw in a recent Bankrate survey that housing affordability is really the key reason why so many Americans haven't bought any housing yet. But one of my colleagues kind of says, and I'm going to part with this, I think, on this question, but he often says that, one of the reasons maybe millennials are holding off on buying a home, but eventually, their income is going to help them catch up. And so they might be able to still afford it. They're just doing it a little bit later in life than their older counterparts. But we've seen that across the board too.
Right.
Even older or younger Americans are getting married a lot later in life. They're having children a lot later in life. And that has an advantage because it allows you to save for retirement more. It allows you to save for emergencies and really get a stronger financial footing.
Yeah. No, I love that last point. I think that there's so many interesting factors that are going into all of these areas that you're obviously covering, and one of them being just demographic trends right now, especially in the labor participation and areas like that, and how that's changing. Speaking of labor, actually, I did want to ask you. I know I've heard multiple people talk about the very strong labor market that we have being one of the contributors to inflation. And so, as the Fed is continuing their efforts to curb inflation through rate hikes, do we expect to see that impacting the strength of the labor market? And what has to happen? What really has to happen at this point to start seeing inflation make the significant progress downwards? Is it going to have to impact the labor market? We talked about, like energy costs and things like that. Are we seeing improvement there? What are some of the like more sticking points of inflation contribution that we're either seeing progress in or we have yet to see progress in and we need to?
Yeah. Well, how much these interest rate hikes are going to impact the labor market, if at all, really is the ultimate question. And you see economists really vary as far as how much. I think even Powell, the Fed chair himself, even hopes that because right now we've had these elevated number of job openings, he's often talked about a so-called soft landing of the economy where, you gradually cool those job openings, you gradually slow demand to get in line with the inflation target. And then hopefully it doesn't result in outright job losses. But some economists are skeptical about that. And they even said in a recent Bankrate survey that by March 2023, the unemployment rate is likely to be 4.6%. Or sorry, not March 2023, March 2024. So
Right.
4.6% from its current level of 3.5% would be higher than 1 percentage point. But I think what that shows also is that, we're starting from this historically strong level. 4.6% unemployment rate, that would be the lowest of any recession we've ever had. Obviously, it's not fun when you lose your job, but that might mean that hopefully it'll be a little bit easier for someone to find a better position, a new position if the job market doesn't take as big of a hit from rate hikes. But I think, to answer your second question, kind of about the relationship between the job market and inflation, right now, I think the job market really is the reason why we are seeing that prices are remaining stickier. The Atlanta Fed has its own kind of sticky price inflation rate. I would recommend viewers to kind of take a look at it. It's really helpful as far as looking at maybe where inflation is coming from right now. If it's more short-term measures that could be volatile, like food and energy, or if it's more from stickier matters like the labor market. And so I was even looking just before our call about some of the industries that might matter to people in, freight markets, especially you've seen, construction jobs. About 4.9% of construction jobs within the industry are open, and wages are up about 5.7% in the first quarter of this year compared to last year. So obviously, that's just kind of a big illustration of the fact that when you have massive amounts of job openings and it's hard for employers to find people to fill these positions, they're likely going to raise wages to, lure more talent, and that could result in stickier prices that kind of get, transitioned, kind of spread throughout the economy down the line.
Yeah. And I know that for people participating in the freight markets, like you said, we also just witnessed some record high wage increases that were in 5-year incremental contracts for labor unions in like the rail space, the ports. And so we can expect to see, in many cases, sustained labor cost for the coming years, and ones that went, some of them actually were retroactive. And so there was like back pay that had to be paid out too over the last couple of years. So very interesting there. Sarah, we are running out of time here, but what's going to be happening in the next couple of weeks? What are some economic data releases that you're going to be paying attention to? What can people kind of be waiting to see? And then how do you cover these? Do you, publish your thoughts on these, and where can they go to see that work?
Yeah, well, I think obviously we have the Fed meeting tomorrow. We have the jobs report on Friday. We have another inflation report the week after that. So it's an exciting time. It's a busy time to be covering the economy. I try to put out commentary after every data release on LinkedIn. So
Yeah.
I'd love to connect with everybody through LinkedIn after this. But I think, the biggest question mark kind of moving forward is, what will the Fed do? A lot of investors, of course, think the Fed could cut rates as early as this fall. Fed officials don't see that. And the other kind of big question mark I think a lot of us are worrying about, or at least paying attention to, is kind of what's going to happen with the debt ceiling. Of course, yesterday we just had Janet Yellen release a new letter to Congress that said that the X date, which is when those extraordinary measures that the Treasury Department that the Treasury Department is currently doing to make sure we can continue covering our bills, those might run out as early as June 1st, which is obviously about a month away. So lots of things to be paying attention to, lots of things that could impact all of us. But
I'm glad you covered that, because I forgot we had a question earlier that said, write a story that the government will run out of money in June. So what are your thoughts on that? So I don't entirely understand that. That's kind of new ground to me. So I'll be looking to see if you're going to be talking about that a little bit more. And I would just encourage anyone listening, if you're like, what's the, jobs data that's coming out? What is the Fed? Like, what is all this stuff? Economics is not easy, speaking as like a layman here. And so if you guys, my suggestion to you is to find people like Sarah, find people like Lee, or people that I've had on the podcast in recent weeks, and just follow them, read their work. You guys do an amazing job of making this something that someone who doesn't have experience in economics can read and understand enough to start educating themselves in economics as it pertains to them and their households and their careers. So really appreciate the work that you do, Sarah. And I'm very thankful that you shared some of that insight today with us on Meet Me for Coffee.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you again, Samantha.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining us today for coffee.